These days, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that America's greatest export is actually its culture. In fact, it's a strange phenomenon of this modern age. Just how much knowledge we Brits have about our Yankee counterparts over across the pond. A flow of knowledge that really, for the most part, only goes one way. Take politics, for example. You'll often hear Brits sharing an opinion on Donald Trump, but you'd be hard put to find an American that knows very much about the British Prime Minister, let alone their politics. The reason for this disconnect is, in a word, Hollywood. In a few more words, it's down to America's ability to make entertainment profitable. In a great many more words, you would say that there are a plethora of factors that have caused this. For starters, the reason that California became the hub of American film was not due to a surplus of talent or excellent shooting locations, but rather because California was the furthest you could get from New York, which made it difficult for New York-based Edison Motion Pictures Company to prove that the burgeoning studios were using their cameras and film, thereby avoiding payment of the huge royalty fees that came along with the use of said cameras and film. This money that would have otherwise bankrupted the studios was then spent on improving the quality of the film productions so that they very quickly became better than any other studios in the world. That created demand for American media, which, well, then exponentially grew their profits. It's also no coincidence that a nation defined by its military budget also sets the standard for technological innovation. Tie into that equation a cultural proclivity of grandiose projects, and you've got a perfect storm for a sort of engineering-based YouTube channel. And what could be more grandiose a project than putting the faces of some of your most fundamental leaders on the side of a huge granite mountain? We don't exactly know a whole lot about why or how it was built. I mean, we can understand the thinking behind it, but also, why build it in South Dakota of all places? If I were to try and think of one thing that would make sense to an American, but 0 sense to a British person, it would be carving the faces of some of our leaders into a mountain. We can't be certain, but we're pretty sure the artist selected for prime ministerial portraits wasn't selected for their painting ability, just the person who could paint the fastest, so they didn't have to stand there too long. Anyway, we're getting off track. Let's talk about Mount Rushmore. It's why you're here. So, before we talk about how the faces got there, we should first cover how the mountain itself got there. Very simple, the Earth put it there, and the stuff that happened after that is where it really gets interesting. The first known inhabitants of the area were the Lakota tribe, hence the name of the state, Dakota. The Lakota tribe as an entity is known through legend to have had their beginnings on the shores of Lake Superior, though their language is said to have predated them and is thought to be from a tribe that lived on the shores of the southern Mississippi River. It's important to qualify the difference here, as the language was spoken by a few other tribes that lived in that part of America. For their part, the Lakota were mostly a hunter-gatherer society who supplemented what they could hunt with crops of corn that they grew. After feuding with another tribe in the area, they were pushed out of the Great Plains in the mid to late 17th century, the Great Plains being the Dakota region of the United States. It's around this time that the first known people began living on and around Mount Rushmore, though it is likely there were others that just weren't documented. The name Mount Rushmore is also fairly contemporary. At the time, it was known by a few names. To the Dakota people, those were the Six Grandfathers and Cougar Mountain. But to early American settlers, the mountain was called Sugarloaf Mountain, Slaughterhouse Mountain, and the Keystone Cliffs. Speaking of colonialism, the first Europeans to arrive in the area that is now South Dakota were a couple of French explorers who promptly claimed that land in the name of France in 1743. Understandably, the natives didn't appreciate this kind of claim when they kind of already lived there. The battles that were fought between the indigenous people and the colonial powers, and then later the American government, well, that's a topic for a whole other video. As it pertains to today's video, though, an agreement was signed in 1868 called the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which brokered a peace between the United States and the Lakota, as well as several other tribes. This agreement created an area of land that would be the absolute property of those tribes, encompassing the areas of what is now South Dakota, Wyoming, and Nebraska. The agreement also stipulated that white settlers would be restricted from entering the area and would be prosecuted if caught. This would be, in essence, a separate state from the United States that was ruled by the tribes and their laws. This meant that breaking the agreement was against the law, and there was absolutely no way the government was going to ignore its own signed treaty. I mean, that would definitely never happen. I mean, even if they found loads of gold. Right? I would like to avoid the mistake that others have made when retelling this event. It's not as though the US government had a state-owned gold mining company that just rolled in and took everything. And despite our jokes here, they simply couldn't just tear up the treaty. However, what they could do was use the very loose language of the treaty to allow for some wiggle room for their responsibilities, such as the policing of the border, because it was their job from preventing any outsiders from entering the land. In fairness, they did do this, but considering the size and technological capacity of the US Army, even in those days, they did a less than stellar job, even before the discovery of gold. It's also not as though the government weren't looking for a reason to evict the indigenous tribes, considering how they sent 2 separate expeditions to verify the presence of gold, which very quickly became national news, and what was at first a trickle of intruders became a deluge of miners and prospectors. When first discovered, a conglomerate of mining companies offered to purchase the land and the mineral rights, an offer that was promptly refused, with the added unanimous response that nothing short of annihilation would remove them from their ancestral lands. Then there was the government's paltry offer of $25,000 for all of the lands, which comes out very roughly to about $665,000 today, which, even before you consider the cultural value of that land, is, well, an insultingly low offer. Every offer the tribes received was refused, insisting that no amount of money would be sufficient for their land. Once the diplomatic method had failed, the tribes began hunting any mining groups that crossed onto their land, which in turn opened the door to the US military rolling in once again and forcibly evicting the tribes, for good this time. In all of the land that was taken, there was also a small ridge that at that time was known as the Six Grandfathers. The land was almost exclusively the property of the local tribes up until the time it was annexed by the United States, and, well, once those floodgates were opened, prospectors from across the United States moved all over the land, thoroughly mapping it and prospecting it for gold as they went. A wealthy investor by the name of Charles E. Rushmore began visiting the area regularly to hunt and prospect. As innocuous as most of the other marble ridges in that part of the world, it was a long time after the annexation of the Great Sioux Reservation that this ridge was renamed after that investor. In 1930, it was officially recognized by the United States Board of Geographic Names as Mount Rushmore. With most peaks getting a name as well, this one stood out in several ways. First was that the mountain had a southward face that gave it near constant sunlight during the day. This was especially true in the summer months. Second was that the land around it was contrived in such a way that it was highly visible from nearly every angle, which made it a landmark that could easily be spotted from a long distance. Of course, this was back when landmark literally meant marks on the land that people could use to navigate themselves. Outside of that, however, it was a corner of the world that remained all but forgotten. As the decades slipped by and the US went from a burgeoning state embroiled in civil wars and land disputes, the mountain remained as unchanged as ever. It simply watched as the US became an international manufacturing powerhouse and began developing its own personality as the protector of freedom, as it became the center of revolutions of every kind, be it technical, financial, industrial, and, of course, cultural. While everything and more changed all around it, the mountain continued unchanged, uninterested by all that was going on around it. It was, in fact, these changes that would rather take an interest in the mountain. By the time the 1920s came around, America was keen to make an expression of its position. In 1923, historian Jonah Robinson, who was the head of the South Dakota Historical Board, conceived of an idea to make a grand memorial to the individuals that had helped shape the modern United States, pitching it as a means of increasing tourism in the area. To him, this memorial would be for the individuals that stood out for their impact upon the history of the United States. It would be a representation of the grand strides that the nation had made to bring it where it was today. And the granite mountains of the Black Hills would be the perfect place to do it. Robinson was able to convince the sculptor Gutzon Borglum to take a trip to the Black Hills and look at his chosen location. At first, this was going to be a location made up of granite pillars called the Needles. However, after visiting, Borglum concluded that the needles were too thin and unstable to be capable of taking any kind of heavy construction. As Borglum was transported around the Black Hills, he saw a mountain with a south-oriented face and a topography that suited being viewed from nearly 180 degrees. This was, of course, Mount Rushmore. He brought the idea back to Robinson, who was initially resistant, but after visiting, he agreed that it would be the perfect location. With this, Robinson and Borglum began pitching the idea to various investors. Robinson brought it to the state senator, who in turn brought it to Congress. In the meantime, Borglum began to find private investors among his rich friends, which begged the question, who are they going to put on the mountain? To us today, when we hear of Mount Rushmore, we instinctively think of those four faces: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Teddy Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln. But they were not the originally planned subjects. Being a historian, Robinson knew of the history of that land, and he knew the history of the nation better than any politician. When he said he wanted to make a memorial of the individuals that had shaped the modern United States, he didn't mean presidents. Originally, he planned for a far more inclusive proposition, a monument to those who had shaped the nation physically as much as they had culturally. His initial proposition was for the monument to be people like Lewis and Clark, Sacagawea, Buffalo Bill Cody, and leaders of the Lakota tribe like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse. However, the powers that be, namely Borglum and Congress, felt the monument would have a broader appeal if it focused on presidents rather than explorers and tribal leaders. It was decided that the likeness of the aforementioned presidents would make a suitably grand installation. At some point during the process, Borglum became infatuated with the idea of this great monument. Perhaps he swore that it was indeed going to become one of the most recognizable monuments in the world, but what's more likely is he would come to see it as his magnum opus and a means of carving his name into the history books. Very soon, his vision began to eclipse that of Robinson's, and more than that, he began to eclipse Robinson himself. It was Borglum's idea to change the subjects of the monument, and in fairness, without this, it's uncertain as to whether the project would have been able to get past the funding phase. For his part, he was able to play on the patriotism of private investors, and also pitching a monument to politicians is a lot easier to do when said monument is of politicians. Indeed, Calvin Coolidge was rather pleased with the idea of having a monument that depicted 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. Coolidge, of course, was a Republican. To hear Borglum put it, the selected presidents represented key facets that led to the modern United States: Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln, representing the nation's birth, growth, preservation, and development respectively, which clearly went down well because the total funding that would go into the project was around $1 million, which equates to around $20 million today. Though half of this would come from private investment and generally only came in dribs and drabs through the process, Borglum wanted to get started as soon as possible. So once there was enough funding to pay for the start of construction and all the planning permission had been acquired, construction went ahead. Before any kind of chisel could be put to rock, the pen had to be put to paper, and Borglum was absolutely going to be the one to do it, so perhaps it would be a good idea to examine the bombastic personality and aspirations of Gutzon Borglum. In doing so, we could start to get a pretty good explanation as to the bizarre nature of the project itself. Borglum was a highly accomplished sculptor with Danish lineage. He had worked on several other large art projects in his time, but Rushmore was by far his largest and greatest. Though he was originally reluctant to come on board, he became infatuated with the idea of designing this monument. What we see today is truly only the surface. For one thing, the enormous faces on the mountain were meant to be enormous heads with torsos attached. You can even see the shape of George Washington's lapels and ties. Due to budget and funding issues, however, that was ultimately not to be. But we're going to find out a bit more about that later. For now, let's just talk about Borglum's vision. In Borglum's mind, as we mentioned, this was going to be his magnum opus, the work with which history would remember his name. His vision was less a monument and more a museum carved into a mountain with a president-shaped billboard on the outside. Within the mountain was going to be what Borglum called the Hall of Records, which would be dedicated to the ways that America had impacted the world. There would be areas dedicated to other great Americans, and another part that would showcase some of America's most precious public documents, namely the Declaration of Independence. Then there would be sections explaining the purpose of the monument and relating the process of creation, and if there was perhaps a corner in the Hall of Records dedicated to little old Borglum himself, well, that would just be a bit of a bonus, wouldn't it? On the outside, there would be a complex around the mountain, though it's unclear as to what the purpose of this complex would be outside of housing tourists. Borglum also envisioned an 800-step staircase carved from marble that took tourists from the designer's studio into a Hall of Records. But as you've probably already surmised, these theme park-esque features of the monument don't exist because they were never built. But au contraire, they do indeed exist. As anyone who has visited the monument can likely tell you, there is a chamber within the mountain, but we'll get to that part in a moment. As you might expect, the removal of a face-shaped amount of rock from the side of a mountain is no mean feat. Times that by 4. And once the designing process was complete, all that was left to do was build this thing. In the space of only a few months, this hard-to-access backwater became a bustling thoroughfare of artisans, miners, and mountain climbers. In the discussions surrounding the project, the vast majority were at least in agreement that the addition of the two most famous presidents of the United States was a foregone conclusion, with this being Washington and Lincoln. Borglum states that the choice for Thomas Jefferson was for his work in nearly doubling the size of the US during his time with the Louisiana Purchase. And Teddy Roosevelt was added in for his work establishing the US National Park Service. The designs, as previously mentioned, called for the presidential figures to be depicted from head to waist. The monument that exists today is 60 foot or 18 meters high from crown to chin. However, if built as originally designed, these colossal figures would theoretically have been 240 feet or 73 meters in height. This was, of course, wildly ambitious, but Borglum and everyone else for that matter must have been feeling pretty ambitious because the first design was approved. And so it was that on the 4th of October 1927, only 4 years after Robinson initially pitched the idea, construction began. Over the course of the project, a total of 300 workers took part in its construction. The area very quickly became a busy work site. First to go up was a staircase that would allow workers to get to the top of the mountain. Then, after a while, a cable car system was built to facilitate the moving of heavy machinery to the peak. Once this was made, a hydraulic pulley system was set up on the peak that would allow the workers to lower themselves onto the mountain face. As previously discussed, this kind of project had never been attempted before by anyone, so there was a lot of technology that had to be either invented or adapted to suit their needs. First was the rigging, which had to make sure the workers were secure while working on the mountain. To solve this, Borglum and his team adapted a type of harness called a bosun seat, which was originally designed for the Navy so as to allow access to a ship's rigging. Then there was the small matter of how you operate heavy machinery on the side of a mountain without falling off. I don't know if you've ever used a jackhammer, but I wouldn't advise doing it dangling several hundred feet off the ground. Then there was the use of pneumatic drills, which, as you can probably already tell, requires a pneumatic compressor. And it's not particularly easy to mount a pneumatic compressor on the side of a mountain. So they had to bring in some of the most powerful pneumatic compressors in the world and then place them at the base of the cliff. The added distance required the extra power. However, in the early stages of the construction, or rather destruction, these drills were secondary to the true star of the show, dynamite. And a lot of it. The work started with George Washington. First, they set about removing the largest parts of the rock face, forming it into the overall shape of a face. They did this mostly by using dynamite. They would drill holes into the rock face, place the dynamite, and then detonate it. This, of course, would have been a fairly skilled job, knowing how the rock would react, how much dynamite to use, and where, as you might imagine, people would be rather upset if George's nose was a little bit off-center. From the very first day, though, there was a real sense of pride in what these workmen were doing. As you can imagine, to be involved in this project would have been a big honor. Borglum was ambitious, but even more than that, he was inspiring. He knew how to motivate, and he focused on the patriotic grandeur of the project to motivate his workers, and he did his best to get the best out of them. Of course, this charisma was somewhat tempered by his bullying demeanor the rest of the time. Overall, though, the work was taken on with a gusto that allowed work to progress quickly. Until it didn't. Remember Borglum's so-called rich friends? Well, they were more of his non-existent rich friends, or rather they existed, but they weren't his friends. They were just some regular old run-of-the-mill rich private investors. So when work started in October of 1927, it was on a cumulative $10,000 that Borglum had gathered from these private investors, which lasted a grand total of 1.5 months before they ran out of money and everyone on the site just packed up and went home. Then in June of 1929, a full year and a half later, Congress finally came through on the funding, committing a full $500,000 to the scheme. The financial history buffs among you will have already heard some alarm bells ringing at that date. The Great Depression would kick off only 2 months later, that August. And as it turned out, huge government-funded vanity projects aren't a good look when millions of people are all of a sudden standing in line for the soup kitchen. However, in a rather fortuitous turn of events, the funding for the project would be approved just before the extent of the crash was known, and Congress agreed to honor the agreement. From there, the funding ran out about a year and a half later, and Borglum was back to going around propositioning investors. Meanwhile, George Washington's face was looking pretty good. However, what was less good was the area allocated Thomas Jefferson's face. It wasn't good, as in that area the rock was too unstable, so Thomas Jefferson, who was originally intended to be built to the right of George Washington, his right, our left, ended up getting moved to the left of George Washington, his left, our right, which suited old George just fine, I'm sure. As the monument began to take shape and the years began to move onwards, sporadic funding caused a stopping and starting of the flow of work. In spite of this, it wasn't long after the moving of Thomas Jefferson's face that we begin to see the sculptors moving in. Their job was to take the general shape of the rock and turn it into faces. In essence, they were to add the fine detail that made them look human, and they were to do it on a scale many hundreds of times larger than anything they'd ever worked on before. This was positive in some ways because they could swap their chisel for jackhammers and the aforementioned pneumatic drills, but it was negative in others in that they had to do work in some pretty appalling conditions. There were quite a few ill health effects suffered by the workers, though they weren't experienced on site. These ill effects were suffered in later life for the most part, the most prominent condition being silicosis, which comes about as a result of breathing in granite dust. It will not cause immediate issues, but over time it will result in pulmonary fibrosis. Masks were provided for the teams of artisans, but the heat from the wall being in near constant sunlight made it nearly impossible for them to breathe with the masks on, so many just took them off. Their method of working was to drill small holes in the rock face at equal distances apart at a depth that they wished to remove, which would weaken the rock. Once this was done, they used jackhammers to break off the chunks of weakened rock, leaving the general features of the face behind, although I imagine they looked like they had pretty bad acne. Once an area had been cleared, other artisans would then go in with finer tools to complete the fine detailing of the faces. George Washington's was the first to be completed in 1934, a whole 7 years after construction had started. It was revealed on Independence Day by allowing a huge American flag that was covering the effigy to fall to the ground because America will always be America, we guess. After that, it was a matter of just ticking off the presidents one by one. The next to be completed was Thomas Jefferson in 1936, Abraham Lincoln in 1937, and finally Teddy Roosevelt on the 2nd of July 1939, and construction for the Visitors Center had already begun by the time they were working on Lincoln. As I said, Borglum was nothing if not ambitious. These ceremonies revealing the completion of the faces were merely a means of garnering interest from investors. He was still dead set on the grand proposition that was the Hall of Records. However, by the time the 40s rolled around, government funding had well and truly dried up. This was in part due to the fact that Borglum's plans had been shifting from day one. There was originally meant to be an 80 by 100 foot commemoration of the Louisiana Purchase, where Lincoln is, and plans for the presidents to be constructed from head to torso were still in full swing. By the time Roosevelt was completed, the work had already begun on Washington's jacket. As for Hall of Records itself, well, I was on its way. Emphasis on the word was, though. For one thing, by 1941, the funding from the government was entirely gone, with any spare funds now going towards the war effort, that being the assistance of the UK and the production of the Liberty ships. Then there was the small matter of Borglum dying unexpectedly that same year, which, as the sole fundraiser for the project, kind of halted it in its tracks. They had carved 70 feet into the mountain for the Hall of Records, they had started on the torso of George Washington, and the Visitors Center still needed a few final touches to be considered complete. However, as nobody was going to be giving any more money, and as it had already been decided that all tourism to the site would be free, there was literally no reason for anyone to go to work. So they didn't. Today, you'll see the rubble at the foot of the mountain from the work being done. At the time, there wasn't even the funds to get that cleared away. The work just stopped and never started again. However, in spite of the fact that a project such as this had never been attempted before, and the fact that many of the construction practices were being made up on the fly, the project never had a worker fatality, and only 2 accidents occurred over the entire project. After the death of Borglum and the beginning of the Second World War, the recently finished monument garnered some attention from the public, receiving an attendance of 390,000 visitors in the first year. In the war years, especially between 43 and 45, the numbers took a dip, but after that, they mostly rose from then on until today, with a few dips in times of financial turmoil. The recent attendance record was set in 2010 with 2.3 million attendees in 1 year. Culturally, it's come to represent 20th century America, and as we've discussed, that was a very different place than modern America and the modern world for that matter. In recent years, it has been suggested that there should be various different additions to the mountain face. These have ranged from tribal leaders like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse to politicians like Ronald Reagan and Barack Obama. These have been mostly rejected due to the vast majority of the stable rock being taken up by the original inhabitants of the mountain. There is also the issue of funding and the uproar that would come from changing an American monument. However, that is not to say that changes have not been made to the mountain in the years after Borglum's death. For many decades after he died, his family were trying to complete the design that he had originally established many decades ago. Most of this was to no avail. However, in 1998, funding from the National Park Service and the Borglum family was enough to put the finishing touches on the 70-foot passage that was supposed to be the entrance to the Hall of Records. At the end of the passage, the floor was dug out and a titanium vault was placed within it. Within the vault was a teakwood box that contained 16 enamel panels. Inscribed upon these panels was a variety of important American texts, including the Constitution and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, as well as a recounting of the life stories of the 4 presidents and also one architect. Can you guess who it was? On the outside, the Park Service paid for a revamp of the visitor center, modernizing the area and adding various different structures. The Lincoln Borglum Museum and the Presidential Trail were both added, as well as the infrastructure around the site being entirely modernized. As the decades have worn on, the monument has appeared in countless pop culture references, the most notable of which was the chase scene across the heads in the 1956 classic North by Northwest. Various people have also become synonymous with the structure, such as the fifth face of Mount Rushmore, aka Benjamin Black Elk, a descendant of the medicine man Black Elk. He has also earned the title of the most photographed person in the world, posing for literally thousands of photos every day for nearly 20 years during the 1950s and 60s, doing all of this dressed in his traditional native attire. In more modern times, the mountain was dragged into controversy. Remember that agreement signed by the Lakota chiefs way back in 1851? Well, for all intents and purposes, that land was still theirs. They had a document signed by the US government giving them sole ownership of that land. They never broke any of the terms, never accepted any offers to sell the land, and ambiguous though the language was, it was inarguable that the land did legally belong to them. In 2007, they brought this grievance up with the United Nations and the US courts, going so far as to establish a new country known as the Republic of Lakota, right there in the United States. This nation would take up an area of roughly 200,000 square kilometers and would contain parts of Nebraska, Wyoming, North Dakota, and of course South Dakota. Unfortunately, in order to be considered a nation, you need to have other nations' agreement that you are indeed a nation. And if your nation removes a big chunk of another nation, and if that nation just so happens to be the most powerful nation in the world, well, you're going to struggle to get other nations to side with you. That's because the United States doesn't take kindly to other nations taking their lands. It's ironic, we know. And if the US doesn't like you, that almost certainly removes any possibility of other nations liking you, because people don't like disagreeing with the United States. It generally ends badly for them, which is a really long way of saying that the United Nations refused their request for nationhood. Of course, this conflict has been embroiled in court battles for many years. The US still has no legal right to that land, and yet they own it, so the US justice system has done its utmost in the intervening years to claim it back. This has taken the form of multiple court battles that all go the same way: the US government versus the Dakota and other tribes. The tribes will invariably win the court case, the US government will offer a settlement that gets larger and larger every time this goes to court, and every time the tribal leaders refuse the money. In 1980, they were offered $105 million for the land, made up of a land valuation of $17.1 million, as well as 5% interest that had been accumulated from when the land was first valued in 1887 and 1980. The offer still exists, and as of 2011 has a compound interest value of over $1 billion, which the Lakota tribe are still refusing, insisting they only want the return of their ancestral lands. And that's where we stand today with the story of Mount Rushmore. I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please do hit like, don't forget to subscribe, and thanks for watching.